The story: little girl's heartbreaking fight to save her fallen dad's canine you won't believe. Why? The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel sliced through the crowded hall of the Silver Creek Community Center, a sound so piercing it seemed to echo inside Emma Carter's small, trembling chest. She was only 7, a fragile figure in a sea of grown-ups, her thin arms wrapped tightly around a pink, ceramic piggy bank. The coins inside rattled faintly with every shiver that ran through her, a soft, desperate clinking that no one else seemed to hear. Tears welled in her hazel eyes, blurring the world into a haze of shadows and voices, but she couldn't look away from the front of the room. Her heart thudded painfully, each beat sinking with the rising bids that threatened to steal away the last piece of her father she had left. $40,000! The auctioneer bellowed, his voice booming with an authority that made Emma flinch. She clutched the piggy bank harder, her knuckles whitening against the smooth, cold surface. It wasn't just a childish trinket to her. It was a lifeline, a vessel holding every penny she'd saved since that awful day 5 years ago when her world had shattered. She'd dropped coins into it through silent nights, her tiny fingers trembling with hope that one day, somehow, it would be enough. Enough to bring him back, not her father, for that was impossible, but Max, his loyal canine partner, the German shepherd who'd stood by his side until the end. Across the room, Max stood tall and alert, his sleek, black and tan fur catching the dim light. His ears twitched, and his deep brown eyes scanned the crowd restlessly, searching. Emma's gaze locked onto him, and for a fleeting moment, she swore he saw her too. His head tilted slightly, and then, with a sudden, desperate lunge, he yanked at the leash held by his handler. A low, urgent whine broke from his throat, cutting through the murmurs of the packed hall. The handler, a stern-faced officer in a crisp uniform, jerked him back, regaining control, but not before the room felt it, an invisible thread, taut and unbreakable, stretching between the little girl and the dog. Emma's breath hitched, a sob catching in her throat as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. She didn't care that people might be staring, didn't care that her small frame trembled like a leaf in a storm. All she could see was Max, his strong, steady presence a mirror to the man she'd lost, Deputy Sheriff David Carter, her daddy. 5 years ago, he'd kissed her forehead, promised her pancakes for breakfast, and walked out the door with Max trotting beside him. He never came back. A drug bust gone wrong, they'd said, a tragedy that left her world silent and grey. Since that day, Emma hadn't spoken a word to anyone, not her mother, not her teachers, not even the kind-eyed therapists who tried to reach her. No one but Max. She'd whisper to him in the quiet of the kennel visits her mother fought to arrange, her voice small and shaky as she told him about school, about the snowflakes she'd caught on her tongue, about how much she missed Daddy. Max would listen, his head resting on her lap, his warm fur soaking up her tears. He understood her in a way no one else could. A silent guardian who carried her father's scent, his courage, his love. And now here in this cold, noisy room they were trying to take him away. 45,000! a bidder shouted, raising a paddle with a swift, careless flick. The motion cut through Emma's hope like a blade, sharp and merciless. She turned her wide, panicked eyes to her mother, Margaret, who stood beside her, a gentle arm wrapped around her thin shoulders. Margaret's face was pale, her lips pressed tight, but her touch was warm, steadying. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, though her voice trembled, betraying the fear she tried to hide. Emma wanted to believe her, wanted to cling to that soft promise, but the numbers kept climbing, 50,000, 55, and each bid felt like a step closer to losing Max forever. Her stepfather, Rick, shifted uneasily nearby, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the room pressed down on him. Emma didn't understand the flicker of relief in his eyes, the way he glanced at her piggy bank with something like pity. To Rick, Max was a chain, a tether, keeping her locked in a past he couldn't reach. But to Emma, Max was her voice, her anchor, the only soul who heard her when the world went quiet. She tightened her grip on the piggy bank, the coins rattling louder now, a fragile symphony of desperation. She'd saved every cent, birthday dollars, tooth fairy quarters, pennies picked from the sidewalk, dreaming of this moment. But as the bids soared beyond her wildest hopes, she felt that dream slipping through her fingers, as fleeting as the snowflakes she used to chase with her father by her side. The air in the Silver Creek Community Center buzzed with the low hum of voices, but to Emma Carter it was all just noise, a dull roar that couldn't drown out the frantic thudding of her heart. She stood small and still, a 7-year-old island in a sea of adults, her pink piggy bank pressed against her chest like a shield. The coins inside clinked faintly, a trembling whisper of everything she'd poured into them, her hopes, her grief, her silent promises. Her eyes, wide and glistening with unshed tears, were fixed on the far side of the room where Max stood. Her father's canine partner, a German shepherd whose presence filled the space with a quiet, unshakable strength. Max was beautiful, his black and tan coat gleaming under the harsh lights, his ears perked as if listening for a command that would never come again. He'd been her daddy's shadow, his loyal companion through every patrol, every late night, every laugh they'd shared before the world turned dark. Now he stood beside a handler in a stiff uniform, his leash taut, his deep brown eyes scanning the crowd with a restlessness that mirrored Emma's own. She clutched the piggy bank tighter, her small fingers digging into its smooth surface, as if she could hold on to him through sheer will alone. And then he saw her. Max's ears flicked forward, his gaze locking onto her tiny figure with a sudden, piercing clarity. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to fade. The bidders, the auctioneer, the rising paddles, all swallowed by the unspoken recognition that passed between them. With a sharp, desperate lunge, Max yanked at his leash, his powerful frame straining toward her. A low, urgent whine broke from his throat, slicing through the murmur of the crowd like a cry for something lost. The handler stumbled, startled by the force of it, and pulled back hard, his grip tightening to regain control. But it was too late. Everyone had seen it, the way Max's eyes never left her, the way his body leaned toward her as if drawn by an invisible thread. It wasn't just a dog reaching for a child, it was a piece of her father reaching for her too. Emma's breath caught, a sob bubbling up as tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks. She didn't care that her face was streaked, didn't care that her hands shook so badly the coins rattled louder now, a fragile echo of her breaking heart. Max was more than a dog to her. He was the last living piece of Deputy Sheriff David Carter, the man who'd filled her days with warmth and safety until a drug bust stole him away 5 years ago. She'd been 2 then, too young to understand why he didn't come home, why his boots stopped sitting by the door, why Max stopped trotting through their yard with that proud, steady gait. But she'd felt it, the silence that swallowed her voice, the weight that pressed her words down until they wouldn't come out for anyone but Max. Beside her, Margaret Carter's arms slipped around her thin shoulders, a gentle squeeze that carried all the love and sorrow a mother could hold. Margaret's face was pale, her eyes shadowed with the same grief that haunted Emma, but her touch was steady, a quiet promise in the chaos. "Shh, sweetheart," she murmured, her voice soft as a lullaby, though it trembled at the edges. Emma leaned into her, the warmth of her mother's embrace a fleeting comfort against the cold fear clawing at her chest. The bids were climbing, 40,000, 45, and each number felt like a wall rising between her and Max, cutting her off from the one soul who understood her silence. She remembered the kennel visits, those stolen moments her mother had fought for, when she'd sit cross-legged on the concrete floor and whisper to Max. She'd tell him about the snowflakes she'd caught that winter, about the nightmares that woke her, about how she still set a plate for Daddy at breakfast sometimes, waiting. Max would listen, his head resting on her lap, his warm breath a steady rhythm against her hands. He never judged her quiet, never pushed her to speak louder. He just stayed, a silent guardian who carried her father's strength in his steady gaze. Now, as she watched him strain toward her, she felt that bond pull tight, a lifeline she couldn't let slip away. The handler steadied Max, his leash taut again, but the dog's eyes never wavered. They held hers across the room, solemn and knowing, as if he felt the same ache she did, the ache of a little girl who'd lost her voice and a dog who'd lost his partner. Emma's tears fell faster, dripping onto the piggy bank, and she prayed, with all the strength her small heart could muster, that this wouldn't be goodbye. The Silver Creek Community Center thrummed with the restless energy of the crowd, but for Emma Carter, it was a distant storm she couldn't quite feel. She stood small and fragile, a 7-year-old swallowed by the clamor of adult voices, her arms wrapped tightly around a pink ceramic piggy bank. The coins inside shifted with every breath she took, a faint, trembling clatter that seemed to whisper her secrets, her hopes, her fears, her 5 long years of saving. Her hazel eyes, red-rimmed and glistening, stayed fixed on Max, the German shepherd across the room, his proud silhouette a tether to a past she couldn't let go. He wasn't just a dog. He was her father's shadow, her silent confidant, the only one who'd heard her voice since the day her world went quiet. 5 years ago, Deputy Sheriff David Carter had walked out their front door, his laughter still ringing in Emma's ears, his promise of a pancake breakfast dangling like a bright thread she'd clung to. Max had trotted beside him, tail wagging, a partner in every sense, loyal, fierce, unbreakable. She'd been 2 then, too little to grasp why he didn't come back, why the house grew cold without his booming voice, why Max stopped bounding through the yard with that eager gleam in his eyes. A drug bust, they'd said, a routine call that spiraled into tragedy, leaving her father's badge on the mantel and a hole in her heart no one could fill. From that day, Emma's words had dried up, locked away behind a wall of grief too heavy for her tiny shoulders. She didn't speak to her mother, didn't answer the teachers who tried to coax her out, didn't whisper to the stuffed animals that lined her bed. No one could reach her, no one but Max. She'd found her voice with him, in the dim light of the kennel, visits her mother, Margaret, had begged for. Sitting on the cold floor, her knees drawn up, she'd lean close and let the words spill out, soft, halting, fragile. She'd tell him about the butterfly she'd seen in the garden, its wings like stained glass, or the way the snow felt on her tongue, sharp and fleeting. She'd tell him about the dreams where Daddy still held her hand, and the mornings she woke up crying because he wasn't there. Max would listen, his head resting heavy and warm on her lap, his deep brown eyes steady, unjudging. He'd nudge her with his nose when the tears came, his fur soaking them up like he could carry her pain for her. He was her bridge to her father, the last living piece of a man who'd been her whole world, and she couldn't lose him. Not now, not ever. 50,000! A man's voice cut through the room, sharp and decisive, jolting Emma from her memories, her breath hitched, fear tightening like a fist around her chest. She glanced up at Margaret, whose arm rested gently around her shoulders, a quiet strength in the way she squeezed. Margaret's face was etched with the same sorrow Emma carried, her eyes shadowed but fierce, a mother fighting to hold her daughter's crumbling world together. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of comfort, though it wavered with the weight of their shared loss. Emma wanted to believe her, wanted to trust that soft promise, but the numbers kept rising, 55,000 now, and each bid was a hammer striking at her hope. Her stepfather, Rick, stood nearby, his broad frame shifting uneasily. His eyes flickered with something Emma couldn't name, relief maybe, or guilt, as he watched the paddles lift higher. To him, Max was a ghost, a tether keeping her trapped in a past he couldn't touch. He didn't understand what her mother did, what Emma felt in every fiber of her being. Max wasn't just a pet. He was her voice, her lifeline, the only soul she'd spoken to in 5 long silent years. Her small hands shook, the piggy bank trembling with her, its coins a desperate chorus of all she'd saved. Every birthday dollar, every tooth fairy quarter, every penny scavenged from the sidewalk. She'd poured her heart into it, dreaming of this day, but as the bids soared beyond her reach, that dream felt like sand slipping through her fingers, leaving her grasping at shadows. The Silver Creek Community Center pulsed with the restless hum of voices, a tide of sound that crashed against Emma Carter's small, trembling frame. She stood there, 7 years old and fragile as a sparrow, her arms locked around a pink, ceramic piggy bank that rattled faintly with every shuddering breath she took. The coins inside, her painstaking hoard of pennies, quarters, dreams, clinked like a fragile heartbeat, a quiet plea no one else seemed to hear. Her hazel eyes, wide and brimming with tears, darted across the room to where Max stood, her father's German shepherd, his sleek fur catching the light, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of rising bids. He was more than a dog to her. He was the echo of her daddy's laughter, the shadow of his courage, the only one who'd heard her voice since the day he was torn away. $50,000, a man near the front barked, his voice slicing through the air with a cold, decisive edge. Emma's breath caught, a sharp stab of fear twisting in her chest as the paddle rose, swift and merciless like a guillotine dropping on her hope. She clutched the piggy bank tighter, her small hands shaking so violently the coins sang a desperate, clattering song. She'd saved every cent. 5 years of whispered wishes dropped into that pink shell, each one a prayer to bring Max home, to keep the last piece of her father close. But the numbers kept climbing, each bid a wall rising higher, shutting her out. 55,000 now, and her heart sank deeper, a stone plummeting into a well of despair she couldn't climb out of. Across the room, Max stood tall, his ears twitching, his deep brown eyes scanning the crowd with a restlessness that mirrored her own. He'd been her daddy's partner, Deputy Sheriff David Carter's loyal shadow, until that awful day 5 years ago when a drug bust stole him away. Emma had been too small to understand why the house grew silent, why Max stopped trotting through their yard with that proud, eager stride. But she'd felt it, the emptiness, the weight of a world without her father's voice calling her Emmy Bug, without his arms lifting her high. She'd stopped speaking then, her words locked behind a wall of grief until Max became her only bridge, the one soul she could whisper to in the quiet of the kennel, her secrets safe in his steady gaze. "Do I hear 55?" the auctioneer boomed, his gavel hovering like a threat. Another paddle shot up. James Hammond, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp suit, his face hard with determination. He owned a security firm, they said, a man with deep pockets and deeper ambitions, and he wanted Max. Not for love, not for loyalty, but for something cold and calculated Emma couldn't grasp. Her eyes widened, panic surging as she turned to her mother, Margaret, who stood beside her, a gentle hand resting on her shoulder. Margaret's face was pale, her lips pressed tight, but her touch was warm, a lifeline in the chaos. "It's okay, sweetheart," she murmured, brushing a tear from Emma's cheek, though her voice quaked with the same dread Emma felt. It wasn't okay. Emma knew it in her bones. They couldn't compete with men like Hammond, with their stacks of money and their careless power. Her stepfather, Rick, shifted beside them, his jaw tight, his eyes flickering with something she couldn't read. Relief, maybe, or resignation. He thought Max was a chain, a weight keeping her tethered to a past he wanted her to outgrow. He didn't see what Margaret did, what Emma lived every day. Max was her voice, her light, the only one who understood the silence she carried. Her hands trembled harder, the piggy bank cold against her chest, its coins a pitiful offering against the tide of bids. She'd dreamed of this moment, counting out her savings, bringing Max home, holding on to her father's love. But now that dream felt like a fragile thread, fraying with every shout from the crowd, every paddle that rose to steal him away. The Silver Creek Community Center thrummed with the weight of held breaths, the air thick with the echo of bids and the sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel. Emma Carter stood small and trembling, a 7-year-old dwarfed by the sea of voices, her arms wrapped tight around a pink ceramic piggy bank. The coins inside clinked faintly, a fragile chorus of every hope she'd tucked away over 5 long years. Pennies scavenged from sidewalks, quarters from lost teeth, dollars folded with whispered prayers. Her hazel eyes, blurred with tears, stayed locked on Max, her father's German shepherd, his steady presence across the room the only thing keeping her from crumbling. He was her lifeline, her voice, the last tether to Deputy Sheriff David Carter, the daddy she'd lost to a drug bust's cruel twist 5 years ago. 55,000! James Hammond's voice rang out, cold and commanding, his paddle slicing the air like a blade through her dreams. Emma's chest tightened, panic clawing at her as the numbers soared beyond her reach. She'd saved every cent in that piggy bank, dreaming of this day, bringing Max home, holding on to the piece of her father she could still touch. But now, with each bid, that dream slipped further away, a fading star she couldn't grasp. Her mother, Margaret, stood beside her, a gentle hand brushing her tears. Her whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart," trembling with the same fear Emma felt. It wasn't okay. They couldn't match men like Hammond with his wealth and his ruthless resolve. Then a new voice broke through the escalating storm, quiet but steady, carrying a weight that stilled the room. 60,000, it said, a calm finality threading through the words. Emma's head snapped up, her breath hitching as she turned to see who'd spoken. At the back of the hall stood Steve Bennett, a rancher she'd only heard whispers about, wealthy, reclusive, a man who rarely stepped into Silver Creek's spotlight. His face was weathered, his eyes shadowed with something deep and unspoken, and his paddle hung steady in the air. Margaret caught her breath beside her, confusion flickering across her pale features, a fragile thread of hope weaving through her heart. Emma didn't know why he'd bid, didn't understand what drove him, but his voice felt like a lifeline tossed into the dark. The hall fell silent, every eye fixed on Bennett as the auctioneer paused, his gavel hovering. Hammond's jaw tightened, his broad frame stiffening, but he didn't counter. 60,000, the auctioneer repeated, his voice ringing clear. Going once, going twice, sold. The word crashed over Emma like a wave, and applause erupted, a roar that barely pierced the fog of her thoughts. Sold. Bennett had won. But what did that mean for Max? For her? Her hands tightened on the piggy bank, its cold surface biting into her palms as reality sank in, heavy and uncertain. She looked to Max, his sleek, black and tan fur catching the light, his deep brown eyes meeting hers across the room. He stood perfectly still, gazing back with a solemn recognition that mirrored her own, as if he too felt the fragile thread of their future hanging between them. Emma's tears fell faster, dripping onto the piggy bank, her small frame trembling with a mix of relief and dread. She didn't know Bennett, didn't know if he'd keep Max locked away on some sprawling ranch, or if he'd see what she saw, the way Max carried her father's soul, the way he'd listened to her whispers when no one else could. 5 years ago she'd lost her daddy, his laughter silenced, his promises of pancakes left unkept. Max had been there, a silent partner in her grief, the only one she'd spoken to since her voice retreated behind a wall of loss. She'd sit with him in the kennel, her words soft and halting, telling him about the snowflakes she'd caught, the nightmares she couldn't shake. He'd rest his head on her lap, his warmth a balm to her wounds, and she'd felt her father in him, his strength, his love. Now as the crowd buzzed and Bennett stepped forward, Emma silently prayed, her heart a fragile drumbeat against her ribs. She couldn't lose Max, not to Hammond, not to anyone. He was her bridge to a past she couldn't let go, her hope for a voice she might reclaim. Her eyes stayed on him, pleading across the distance, and in his steady gaze she saw the same quiet vow. This wasn't goodbye. The snow fell gently outside Emma Carter's bedroom window, a soft veil of white blanketing Silver Creek in a hush that felt both tender and mournful. She sat curled on the sill, 7 years old and small as a whisper, her knees drawn up, her hazel eyes tracing the flakes as they danced in the dim evening light. The room around her was a quiet museum of memories, faded photographs on the dresser, a worn stuffed bunny with one drooping ear, a pair of tiny boots her father had bought her, still waiting by the door as if he might walk in and lace them up. Her fingers brushed absently against the bunny's soft fur, its eyes dulled by years of silent comfort, and a pang tightened her chest, sharp and familiar. 5 years had passed since her world broke apart, yet the ache of losing Deputy Sheriff David Carter felt as raw as if it had happened yesterday. From the doorway, Margaret Carter watched her daughter, her heart twisting in a quiet, helpless ache. She leaned against the frame, arms crossed over her chest, her face etched with the lines of a grief she'd carried too long. Emma didn't turn, didn't speak, hadn't spoken to anyone but Max since that terrible day. But Margaret could feel the weight of her silence, heavy as the snow piling up outside. The room smelled faintly of pine and dust, a lingering echo of better times when David's laughter had filled it, when he'd scoop Emma into his arms and spin her until she giggled, her tiny voice a melody that lit their small home. Now it was just the two of them, tethered by loss, and Max, the German shepherd who'd been David's shadow, was the only thread keeping Emma from slipping away entirely. David had been the soul of their family, a deputy sheriff loved by Silver Creek for his steady hands and warm heart. He'd walk the streets with Max at his side, the pair inseparable. David with his easy grin, Max with his alert ears and loyal gait. Margaret could still see them coming home, David's badge glinting in the sun, Max trotting proudly beside him, his tail wagging like a metronome of joy. She remembered the day it all shattered, a routine drug bust, they'd called it, until it wasn't. A call had come late that night, sharp and final, and when she'd opened the door it wasn't David standing there but an officer with downcast eyes, Max pacing behind him, whining low in his throat. Her husband was gone, taken by a bullet in a shadowed alley, and something in Max had broken too. He'd survived, but his eyes carried a hollow glint, a piece of him lost alongside David. Emma had been two then, too young to understand why Daddy didn't come back, why his boots stayed empty, why Max stopped bounding through the yard with that eager bark. But she'd felt it, the silence that swallowed her voice, the grief that locked her words away. She'd stopped speaking, her small world shrinking to whispers only Max could hear. In the kennel visits Margaret fought to arrange, Emma would sit with him, her hands buried in his fur, her voice soft as a secret. She'd tell him about the stars she'd counted, the flowers she'd pressed into books, the way she still waited for Daddy's footsteps. Max would listen, his head heavy on her lap, his warmth a lifeline through her pain, and Margaret knew he was more than a dog. He was David's echo, the keeper of Emma's fragile heart. Now, as the snow fell thicker, Margaret stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the floor. "Emma, sweetheart," she said softly, her voice a thread of love woven with sorrow. Emma didn't move, her eyes fixed on the flakes, but her fingers tightened on the bunny, a silent ache Margaret felt in her bones. 5 years, and the pain still cut deep, a wound that time couldn't heal. Max was out there, facing an auction that threatened to take him away, and with him the last piece of David they could hold. Margaret's chest tightened, a vow forming in the quiet. She'd fight for him, for Emma, for the family they'd once been, no matter the cost. The kitchen of the Carter home was steeped in shadows, the faint glow of a single bulb casting long, jagged lines across the worn linoleum. Margaret Carter stood frozen near the doorway, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. The phone in Rick Thompson's hand gleamed like a traitor's blade, its screen still lit with the call he'd just ended. She'd overheard it. His hushed voice, strained and low, threading through the stillness of the house. "I'll talk to Margaret again," he'd said, "but I can't promise anything." And then the name, James Hammond, slipped from his lips, sharp and cold, a name that twisted her stomach into knots. She stepped forward, her arms folding tight across her chest, her voice cutting through the quiet like a shard of glass. "Who was that, Rick?" Rick turned, his broad shoulders hunching as if he could shrink from the weight of her gaze. He sighed, rubbing his temples, guilt flickering in his eyes like a candle caught in a draught. "James Hammond," he admitted, his tone heavy with resignation. "He still wants Max, says it'd give the dog purpose, structure." Margaret's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a thin line as anger flared hot and fierce in her chest. Max, her late husband, David's German shepherd, Emma's lifeline, wasn't some tool to be traded. He was family, a living piece of the man they'd lost 5 years ago, a tether to the laughter and love that once filled this home. "Max has a purpose," she snapped, her voice low but steady. "Emma, he's the only one who truly understands her." Rick shook his head, frustration etching lines into his face. "That's the problem, Margaret. Emma isn't healing. Maybe Max is keeping her trapped in the past." His words landed like a blow, and Margaret felt her breath catch, a flare of fury mingling with the ache she carried every day. Trapped? Emma, her 7-year-old daughter, hadn't spoken a word to anyone since David died, since that drug bust stole him away and left her world silent. No one but Max. In the kennel, her small hands buried in his fur, she'd whisper secrets she couldn't share with the world, about the snowflakes she caught, the dreams where Daddy still held her. Max listened, his steady presence a balm to her wounds, and through him Margaret saw glimmers of the girl Emma used to be. "Max is the only connection she has left to her father," Margaret said, her voice rising, trembling with a mother's fierce love. "If we take that away, she might lose herself completely." Rick looked away, his jaw tight, his silence a wall between them. He'd come into their lives 2 years ago, a steady hand when Margaret's world was crumbling. But he didn't understand, not fully. To him, Max was a reminder of pain, a ghost keeping Emma from moving on. But Margaret knew better. She'd seen the light in Emma's eyes when she sat with Max, the way her silence softened into something alive. He wasn't a chain, he was her voice, her bridge back to a world she'd lost. Before Rick could respond, her phone buzzed on the counter, an unknown number flashing across the screen. She answered cautiously, her heart still racing. "Hello?" A deep voice replied, calm and measured. "Mrs. Carter, this is Steve Bennett. We haven't met, but I think we need to talk." Margaret's brow furrowed, curiosity cutting through her anger. Bennett, a wealthy rancher, a recluse, was a name she knew only in passing. "About what?" she asked, her tone guarded. "About Max," he said, "and about James Hammond." Her grip tightened on the phone, a shiver running down her spine. Something in his voice, steady, solemn, promised answers, maybe hope. She agreed to meet him at the diner that afternoon, her mind swirling with questions as she hung up. Rick watched her, his eyes heavy with regret, but Margaret turned away, her resolve hardening. She glanced toward Emma's room, where her daughter slept, clutching David's old badge, and felt a vow take root. Max was more than a dog. He was Emma's heart, their fight, and she'd protect him, no matter what secrets Bennett held or what battles lay ahead. The snow dusted Margaret Carter's shoulders as she stepped into the Silver Creek diner, her breath fogging in the crisp afternoon air. Inside, the hum of clinking dishes and murmured voices wrapped around her, a fragile shield against the storm brewing in her chest. She spotted Steve Bennett immediately, seated in a booth near the back, his weathered hands folded on the table, his grey eyes shadowed with a quiet intensity. He stood as she approached, extending a hand with a polite nod, his voice low and gentle. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Carter." She slid into the seat across from him, her fingers tightening around her purse, her heart thudding with a mix of weariness and wary hope. "About what?" she asked, her tone guarded, still raw from the fight with Rick, still reeling from the name James Hammond whispered in her kitchen. Bennett didn't waste time. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but laced with something heavy, grief, maybe, or resolve. "I know you're wondering why someone like me would involve himself in your family's situation," he began, his eyes meeting hers with an honesty that made her breath catch. "But Hammond's interest in Max goes deeper than business." Margaret tensed, her fingers digging into the leather of her purse as a chill crept up her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Bennett's expression darkened, a shadow passing over his face. "Your husband was investigating Meridian Pharmaceuticals when he died, wasn't he?" The words hit her like a punch, stealing the air from her lungs. David, her David, had been a deputy sheriff with a heart too big for the small town of Silver Creek, a man who'd kiss Emma goodnight and promise her pancakes, who'd walk out the door with Max at his side and a grin that lit her world. 5 years ago, a drug bust had taken him, a routine call turned deadly, leaving her with nothing but his badge and a silence that swallowed their home. He'd mentioned a case once, late at night, his voice low and troubled, something big, something dangerous, but he'd spared her the details, shielding her as he always did. Now Bennett's words cracked that shield wide open. "He was," she managed, her throat tight, her mind racing back to those fleeting moments. David's furrowed brow, his quiet, "It's nothing, Maggie, just work." Bennett nodded, his gaze solemn. "My daughter, Jessica, worked at Meridian. She found out about dangerous practices, chemicals they weren't supposed to use. She reported them. 3 weeks later, she died in a suspicious accident. His voice broke slightly, and Margaret felt a shiver of recognition, a shared wound bleeding between them. David was investigating her case he continued, and Max was with him. That dog's trained to detect those chemicals. Hammond's firm just secured a big contract with Meridian. He wants Max because he's evidence, a threat to his new client's secrets. Margaret's heart pounded, a rush of fear and fury flooding her veins. Max, her little girl's lifeline, the German shepherd who'd sat with Emma through 5 years of silence, was more than a memory. He was a key, a witness to the truth David had died for. She thought of Emma, her 7-year-old daughter, curled up at home, clutching David's badge, whispering to Max in a voice no one else could hear. Since that awful day, Emma hadn't spoken. Not to her, not to Rick, not to the world, only to Max, her words a fragile thread tying her to the father she'd lost. He was her bridge, her comfort, and now Margaret realized he was their fight. She met Bennett's gaze, her hands trembling, but her resolve hardening. "I had no idea," she whispered, the weight of it sinking in. "Few people do," he replied gently, leaning back. "But Max represents something bigger than any of us knew." The diner faded around her, the clatter of plates, the murmur of voices, leaving only the truth, stark and urgent. She couldn't let Hammond win, couldn't let him take Max, not when he meant everything to Emma, not when he held the justice David had chased. As she rose to leave, her mind churned with determination, a mother's fierce love igniting a fire she hadn't known she still had. The Silver Creek diner buzzed faintly around Margaret Carter, the clink of coffee cups and hum of voices, a distant echo against the storm raging in her mind. She sat across from Steve Bennett, her hands clenched tight around a steaming mug, the heat seeping into her palms, but doing little to thaw the chill that had settled in her bones. His words still hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Max, her little girl's lifeline, wasn't just a dog. He was evidence, a living key to the truth her husband, David, had died chasing. Bennett's grey eyes held hers, steady and solemn, carrying a grief she recognized too well. "Hammond wants Max because he's a threat," he'd said, and now, as the weight of it sank in, Margaret felt her world tilt, fear and fury coiling tight in her chest. Bennett leaned forward, his voice low and measured, each word a stone dropped into the still waters of her resolve. Max was trained to detect specific chemicals Meridian was using, illegally, he explained, his weathered hands resting on the table, steady despite the tremor in his tone. "Jessica, my daughter, uncovered it. She worked there, saw what they were hiding, and reported it. 3 weeks later, she was gone. An accident, they called it. David was on her case, digging into Meridian when he died. Max was with him, every step. Hammond's firm just signed a fat contract with them. That dog's not just a pet to him, he's a loose end, a witness they can't afford to let bark." Margaret's breath caught, a sharp ache blooming behind her ribs as memories of David flooded back. His warm grin, the way he'd ruffle Emma's hair, the quiet strength in his voice when he'd kiss her goodnight. 5 years ago, a drug bust had stolen him. A routine call turned deadly, leaving her with his badge and a silence that swallowed their home. He'd mentioned something once, late at night, his brow furrowed over a stack of papers. Something big, something he wouldn't let her carry. "It's nothing, Maggie," he'd said. But now she saw it. He'd been chasing justice, shielding her and Emma from the danger he'd faced, and Max, loyal, fierce Max, had been there, his nose trained to sniff out the secrets that cost David his life. Her thoughts spiraled to Emma, her 7-year-old daughter curled up at home with David's old badge clutched tight. Since that awful day, Emma hadn't spoken, not to her, not to Rick, not to the world, only to Max. In the kennel, her small hands buried in his fur, she'd whisper about the snowflakes she'd caught, the dreams where Daddy still held her, her voice a fragile thread, tying her to a father she couldn't keep. Max listened, his head heavy on her lap, his warmth a lifeline through her silence, and Margaret had clung to those moments, the only glimmers of her little girl's soul. Now, knowing he carried David's fight, he was more than a comfort. He was their legacy, their shield against a truth too big to bear alone. "I had no idea," she whispered, her voice trembling as the pieces clicked into place. Bennett nodded, his gaze softening. "Few people do, but Max represents something far greater than any of us realized." The diner faded, the chatter, the clatter of plates, leaving only the weight of his words, the danger lurking in Hammond's shadow. Margaret's hands shook, coffee sloshing faintly in her mug, but beneath the fear, a fire ignited, fierce and unyielding. She couldn't let Hammond win, not when Max meant everything to Emma, not when he held the justice David had died for. Her little girl deserved her voice, her healing, and Margaret would fight tooth and nail to give it to her. As she stepped out into the snow-dusted afternoon, her mind churned with determination. She pictured Emma's wide, trusting eyes, Max's steady gaze, and felt a vow take root, deep, unshakable. This wasn't just about a dog anymore, it was about her family, their past, their future. She'd protect Max, unravel the truth, and bring him home, no matter what it took. The Carter home was cloaked in the stillness of night, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the only sound piercing the silence that had settled like dust over everything. Margaret Carter stood in the dim glow of her laptop, her eyes locked on the screen, her breath shallow and jagged. The email stared back at her, its words a cold black-and-white betrayal that cut deeper with every line. "Thank you, Rick, for your continued assistance in persuading locals to withdraw support from Margaret's campaign." It was from Hammond's assistant. A dagger slipped quietly into her trust, and as she read it again, disbelief and fury surged through her, trembling in her hands. Rick, her husband, the man she'd let into their broken world, had been working against her, against Emma, against the fight to bring Max home. Her gaze flicked toward Emma's room where her 7-year-old daughter slept. A small shadow curled beneath the weight of her father's old badge. A fierce protectiveness roared to life in Margaret's chest, hot and unyielding. Emma had lost so much. David, her voice, 5 years of a childhood drowned in silence, and now this? The idea that Rick, someone she'd trusted to hold their fragile family together, would sabotage her healing felt like a wound too deep to fathom. She grabbed the printed email, its edges crumpling in her grip, and stormed into the kitchen where Rick stood by the counter, sipping coffee as if nothing had changed. The mug clattered faintly as she slammed the paper down, startling him, his eyes widening as he turned to face her. "What is this, Rick?" Her voice was cold, shaking with a fury she could barely contain. He scanned the page, his shoulders slumping as he sighed, rubbing his temples like a man bracing for a storm. "It's not what you think," he said, guilt flickering in his gaze. But Margaret cut him off, her voice sharp as a blade. "Not what I think. You're turning people against our family, against Emma." Her words cracked with the weight of her pain, 5 years of holding Emma through silent nights flashing before her. Rick straightened, his tone defensive. "I'm trying to help. Can't you see? Emma's attachment to Max isn't healthy. Hammond can give him a proper environment. She needs to move on." Margaret stared at him, incredulous, her heart pounding as tears stung her eyes. "Move on," she snapped. "Max is her lifeline. He's all she has left of her father, and you're helping Hammond rip that away from her." She thought of Emma in the kennel, her small hands buried in Max's fur, her whispers soft and fragile, about snowflakes, about dreams where David still laughed. Since that drug bust stole him 5 years ago, Emma hadn't spoken, not to her, not to anyone, only to Max, the German shepherd who'd been David's shadow, his partner, his soul. Rick avoided her gaze, his voice dropping low and weary. "I'm not trying to hurt her, Margaret, but this obsession, it's tearing us apart. It's destroying our chance at a normal life." A normal life? The words echoed hollowly, and Margaret felt the sting of tears, her voice steady despite them, filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve. "Emma's healing is our life. If you can't understand that, maybe you don't belong here." The air between them thickened, the weight of her words hanging heavy, unspoken consequences reverberating in the silence. Rick nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging in resignation. "I'm sorry, Margaret," he murmured, turning to leave the room, his footsteps fading into the dark. She stood there, the email crumpled in her fist, her chest heaving as she fought the ache of betrayal. Emma deserved more than a stepfather who'd falter, more than a world that kept taking. Max was her bridge, her voice, and Margaret would fight for him, for her, with every breath she had left. The night stretched on, but her resolve burned bright, a mother's love stronger than the shadows closing in. The Silver Creek diner glowed softly in the late afternoon light, its windows fogged with the warmth of coffee and quiet chatter. But inside, Margaret Carter felt the cold grip of determination tightening around her heart. She sat across from Steve Bennett, her hands clutching a steaming mug, the bitter scent grounding her as she poured out the latest blow. "Hammond is using Rick to sabotage us," she said, her voice strained, still raw from the betrayal she'd uncovered in that damning email. "He's succeeding. Several big donors pulled their pledges today." The words tasted like ash, each one a reminder of Rick's quiet treachery, of the fragile hope she'd built for Emma slipping through her fingers. Bennett's grey eyes narrowed, his weathered face thoughtful as he leaned back in the booth, the lines of his jaw tightening. "Hammond's reach is extensive," he said, his tone low and measured, "but he's reckless. He's counting on you, folding under pressure." Margaret's gaze sharpened, meeting his with a spark of defiance that hadn't dimmed despite the ache in her chest. "I won't fold," she replied, her voice steady, a vow carved from 5 years of holding her daughter through silent nights. "But I need your help, Mr. Bennett. I can't fight this alone." He nodded, a solemn weight in the gesture, and a faint smile touched his lips. "Call me Steve," he said. "We both have personal stakes here, Margaret. We'll see this through together." The waitress approached, refilling their coffees with a soft smile before stepping away, and Bennett leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. "I've arranged a meeting tomorrow with someone who might provide critical evidence against Hammond and Meridian," he said, his eyes glinting with purpose. "It won't be easy. We'll need to tread carefully." Margaret's heart quickened, a rush of hope mingling with the fear that had shadowed her since Bennett's revelations at their last meeting. Evidence, something tangible to fight with, to honor David's sacrifice, to keep Max by Emma's side. She thought of her little girl, 7 years old and silent since that drug bust stole her father, whispering only to Max, the German shepherd who'd been David's partner, his soul. Max was her bridge, her voice, and now Margaret knew he was a key to the justice David had died chasing. She nodded, her resolve hardening like steel. "I'm in," she said, the possibility of giving meaning to David's death, a truth buried in Meridian's shadows, filling her with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. 5 years ago he'd walked out their door, Max trotting beside him, promising Emma pancakes with that warm grin she'd loved. A call had come later, sharp and final, shattering their world, leaving her with his badge and a daughter who'd stopped speaking. Max had survived, but he carried a hollow ache, a piece of David lost with him, and Emma had found her whispers in his steady presence, secrets about snowflakes, about dreams, about a father she couldn't let go. Now, as she sat with Bennett, Margaret felt the weight of their shared loss. His daughter Jessica, taken by Meridian's secrets, and David, felled by the same dark thread. They weren't just fighting for a dog, they were fighting for their children, for the pieces of their hearts stolen too soon. She pictured Emma at home, curled up with David's badge, her small hands trembling as she waited for a world that kept taking. Margaret wouldn't let it take Max too, not when he held Emma's healing, not when he carried David's fight. The diner's warmth wrapped around her, but it was the fire in her soul that burned brightest, a mother's love, ready to face Hammond's shadows with Bennett at her side. As she left, the snow crunched under her boots, her breath fogging in the cold, but her steps were firm. Tomorrow, they'd meet this ally, uncover the truth, and she'd bring Max home, for Emma, for David, for the family they still were, deep in their bones. The snow crunched faintly beneath Margaret Carter's boots as she stood beside Steve Bennett, outside an old farmhouse on the edge of Silver Creek, the afternoon sky pale and heavy with the promise of more. Her breath fogged in the cold, her hands trembling, not from the chill, but from the weight of what lay ahead. The weathered wooden door creaked open, and Tom Abrams greeted them, his lined face etched with nervous caution, his eyes darting past them as if the shadows held secrets too dangerous to name. He ushered them inside, the air thick with the scent of dust and old wood, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken, a mother's fierce resolve pulsing through her veins. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about Emma, about David, about a truth buried too long. Tom's hands shook as he handed Bennett a stack of papers, their edges yellowed and creased, each one a whisper of the past. "These show unauthorized chemical experiments at Meridian," he said, his voice low and unsteady, glancing around the dim room as if the walls might listen. "Your daughter, Jessica, was killed because she found out too much. Deputy Carter and Max got too close. Hammond knows Max is evidence. He won't stop." Margaret's heart pounded, a thunderous beat against her ribs as she took the documents, her fingers brushing the ink that held David's final fight. 5 years ago, he'd walked out their door, Max at his side, his grin promising Emma pancakes, his voice promising her safety. A drug bust had taken him, a call turned deadly, leaving her with his badge and a silence that swallowed their home. Now she held proof he'd died protecting something bigger, something that linked him to Jessica, to Meridian's dark heart. She scanned the pages, memos, reports, scribbled notes in David's familiar hand, and felt a shiver of recognition, of grief, reborn. He'd come home late those last weeks, his brow furrowed, his laughter quieter, brushing off her questions with a tired, "It's nothing, Maggie." But it wasn't nothing. He'd been chasing justice, shielding her and Emma from the danger he'd faced, and Max had been there. His nose trained to sniff out the chemicals that cost him his life. Her little girl, 7 and silent since that day, had found her voice in Max, whispering to him about snowflakes, about dreams where Daddy still held her, her small hands buried in his fur. He was her bridge, her healing, and now, Margaret saw, he was their weapon against the shadows that took David. Tom's gaze met hers, grave and steady. "This isn't just about your dog or your daughter, Mom," he said, his voice rough with warning. "These people are dangerous if they find out I spoke to you." He didn't finish, but the fear in his eyes said enough. Margaret straightened, her resolve hardening like iron. "I won't let them hurt anyone else," she said, her voice firm, a vow carved from 5 years of holding Emma through silent tears. Not again. She thought of her daughter at home, curled up with David's badge, her small frame trembling with a hope Margaret couldn't let die. Max was more than a pet. He was Emma's heart, David's legacy, and now the key to a justice she'd fight for with every breath. As they left, the snow fell thicker, the documents tucked safely in her coat, their weight a promise against her chest. She glanced at Bennett, his face set with the same quiet fire, a father's grief fueling their shared cause. The farmhouse faded behind them, but the truth burned bright. David had died for this, for Jessica, for a truth Meridian buried. Margaret's steps were steady, her mind racing with the next move. She'd bring Max home, unravel Hammond's lies, and give Emma the peace she deserved, no matter the cost. The cold bit at her skin, but inside a mother's love blazed, fierce and unyielding, ready to face whatever came next. The Carter home was wrapped in the quiet of evening, the soft glow of a single lamp spilling across the living room where Margaret Carter sat, the weight of Tom Abrams's documents still heavy in her hands. She'd locked them away in a drawer, their secrets safe for now, but her mind churned with the truth they held. David's fight, Meridian's shadows, Max as the key. Her breath hitched as she glanced toward Emma's room, where her 7-year-old daughter slept, a small silhouette clutching her father's badge, her silence a wound Margaret carried every day. 5 years since that drug bust stole David, 5 years since Emma's voice retreated, except with Max, the German shepherd who'd been his partner, her whispers to him the only echo of the girl she'd been. Footsteps creaked on the stairs, and Margaret turned to see Rick Thompson descending, his broad frame slumped, his eyes heavy with a regret she hadn't seen before. He paused in the doorway, the dim kitchen light casting shadows across his face, and for a moment neither spoke, the air thick with the fallout of his betrayal. She'd found the email, seen his quiet sabotage for Hammond, felt the sting of trust shattered. But now, as he stepped closer and sat across from her, his voice broke the silence, soft and raw. "I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, his hands clasping tight on the table. "I thought removing Max would help Emma let go. I've only made things worse." Margaret's chest tightened, a tangle of anger and exhaustion warring within her. She thought of Emma in the kennel, her small hands buried in Max's fur, whispering about snowflakes, about dreams where David still laughed, her voice, a fragile thread Max alone could coax out. Since that awful day, when a call had come and David didn't, Emma had stopped speaking. Not to her, not to Rick, not to the world, only to Max, who carried David's strength, his love. Rick had come into their lives 2 years later, a steady hand when hers trembled, but he'd never understood, not until now, maybe. "He's her lifeline," she said, her voice gentle but firm, holding the weight of 5 years. "You didn't see that." Rick nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands, his shoulders sagging under the truth. "I see it now," he said, his tone earnest, rough with remorse. "I will, whatever it takes. I'll stand with you, with Emma and Max, not Hammond." Margaret studied him, searching his eyes for the sincerity she needed, the trust she'd lost. The kitchen stretched silent between them, a fragile truce taking root, and she rose, pausing at the doorway. "I hope you mean it, Rick," she said, her voice steady, a quiet warning laced with hope. "Because right now, trust is all we have left." She climbed the stairs, her steps soft, and slipped into Emma's room. The little girl slept, her breaths even, David's badge glinting faintly in her small hands. Margaret smoothed her daughter's hair, whispering a silent vow to protect her, to bring Max home, for her healing, for David's justice. Downstairs, Rick stayed, a solitary figure in the dim light, and as the snow fell outside, blanketing Silver Creek in quiet, Margaret lay awake. Margaret lay, Her thoughts were heavy but clear. She saw Emma's wide, trusting eyes, Max's steady gaze, and the battle ahead loomed, dangerous and steep. 5 years ago, David had walked out, Max at his side, promising pancakes, promising forever, and a bullet had taken him, leaving silence and a fight she'd only now uncovered. But she wasn't alone anymore. Rick's redemption, fragile as it was, offered a thread of hope, a chance to mend their fractured family. She listened to Emma's gentle breathing through the thin wall, her heart swelling with a love fierce enough to face Hammond, Meridian, anything. Max was their key. Emma's voice, David's legacy, and she'd fight for him, no matter the cost, until he was home, until her little girl could whisper again, safe in the warmth of a family made whole. The sun rose pale and cold over Silver Creek, a brittle dawn that seemed to hold its breath before the storm. Inside the Carter home, Emma sat at the kitchen table, her small frame dressed in her best blue frock, her fingers wrapped tight around a chipped pink piggy bank. The coins inside clinked faintly, a trembling hymn of every hope she'd saved. 5 years of pennies, quarters, whispers for Max, her father's German shepherd, her voice in a world gone silent. She hadn't spoken since the night before, her hazel eyes fixed on the window, waiting, but her determination sang louder than words, a quiet fire Margaret Carter could feel in her bones. She moved around the kitchen, her hands trembling as she wove Emma's hair into 2 neat braids, each strand a thread of love binding them through the chaos ahead. Rick lingered by the door, his broad shoulders tense, the air between them softened by a fragile truce. He'd betrayed them once, siding with Hammond, but last night's confession, raw, remorseful, had shifted something. He'd withdrawn his support from the enemy, poured his savings into Emma's cause, and now he stood ready, a silent promise in his stance. They drove to the Silver Creek Community Center in silence, the annual law enforcement auction already alive with noise, news crews buzzing outside, rows of chairs filling with donors, reporters, townsfolk. But Emma saw only Max, and when Officer Reynolds led him into the hall, her breath caught, her small hands tightening on the piggy bank. Max's ears pricked, his black and tan coat gleaming under the lights, his nose twitching as he scanned the crowd. Then his gaze landed on Emma, and he froze, his body stiffened, then softened into a tail wag, a soft whine escaping his throat. The room noticed, cameras clicked, a whisper rippling through. "That's her. The Carter girl." Margaret gripped Emma's hand, her voice a steady murmur. "Stay close, sweetheart." 5 years ago, David had walked out with Max at his side, promising pancakes, his laughter a melody in their home. A drug bust had taken him, leaving silence, leaving Emma whispering only to Max, about snowflakes, about dreams, about a father she couldn't keep. He was her bridge, and now they'd fight to bring him home. The auction began, gift baskets, vouchers, memorabilia, but the air shifted when the auctioneer, a broad man in a too-tight suit, stepped up. Next up, Canine Max, 7 years old, trained in narcotics detection, search and rescue, suspect apprehension, starting bid, $2,500. Margaret raised her paddle, her heart pounding. "3,000, James Hammond called, slick in his navy suit, his eyes avoiding Emma. Steve Bennett countered, 3,500, and the bids flew. 4, 5, 6,000. Rick's hand steadied Margaret's shoulder as she bid their last, 6,000. Emma opened her piggy bank beside her, counting coins with shaking hands, each clink a plea. 7,000, Hammond barked. Bennett didn't flinch. 10. The room hushed, the numbers soaring, 12-5, 15, 20. Margaret froze, her chest tight. They had nothing left. "35,000, Bennett said, standing tall. Gasps erupted. Hammond hesitated, then shot back. 45, then Emma's voice, small, shaky, piercing, cut through. Wait! Every head turned as she stood, holding her piggy bank high. I want to add my money. The auctioneer faltered. Miss, this is an adult event. But Bennett interrupted, calm and firm. She's a bidder. This is her savings. Emma stepped into the aisle, her shoes clicking, Max watching her every move. This is everything I have, she said, holding up a dollar bill, her voice trembling but clear. He's not just a dog. He's my dad's partner. He's all I have left. The room stilled, even Hammond faltered. Bennett raised his paddle. 60,000, Hammond counted. 70. But Max broke free, pulling toward Emma, sitting at her side as she hugged him, coins scattering like stars. No more bids, Bennett said. Final. 75, Hammond snapped, but the gavel fell. Sold, to bidder 28. Applause roared, Margaret rushing to Emma, tears streaming as she held her daughter and Max tight. For now, he was theirs, but the fight wasn't over. The Silver Creek Town Hall hummed with the weight of anticipation, its hearing room transformed into a battlefield of folding chairs and watchful eyes. Townsfolk, off-duty officers, reporters, officials, all turned toward the long table where the council sat. Emma Carter perched at the center, small and steady in her best blue dress, her fingers curled tight around Max's leash like it was her lifeline. The German shepherd sat beside her, his black and tan coat gleaming, his head resting on her knee, a quiet strength in his gaze. Margaret Carter sat to her left, spine straight, her face a mask of composed resolve, hiding the storm of hope and fear within. Rick stood to her right, adjusting his tie, his eyes steady with a conviction she hadn't seen before, redeemed, perhaps, from the shadows of his doubt. Across the room, James Hammond loomed, flanked by sharp-suited lawyers, his glass-cold eyes fixed ahead, while Steve Bennett stood near the back, arms crossed, his quiet presence a pillar of support. Councilwoman Teresa Blake opened the meeting, her voice calm but firm. This proceeding concerns the placement of K9 Max, retired service dog, and the petition to assign him to the Carter family. We're here to determine if an exception can be made. Sheriff Evans leaned forward, his throat clearing gruffly. With all due respect, this is about public safety. Max is trained, narcotics, search and rescue, apprehension. He's not a house pet. Emma's a minor. Rick stood before Margaret could, his voice rough but sure. I doubted this at first, he said, glancing at Emma, at Max. I thought her connection to him was unhealthy, keeping her stuck. I was wrong. He didn't trap her. He brought her back. He's why she's speaking again. The crowd murmured, and Margaret's heart swelled, a fragile truce with Rick solidifying. 5 years ago, David had walked out, Max at his side, promising pancakes, his laughter a melody, until a drug bust stole him, leaving Emma silent, whispering only to Max about snowflakes, about dreams. Councilwoman Blake nodded. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. Dr. Martin, Emma's progress? Dr. Martin Winters stepped forward, his voice clinical yet warm. Emma exhibits selective mutism from her father's death. Therapy failed, until Max. Her verbal expression, emotional regulation, trust, all improved with him. Removing him would be devastating. Hammond's lawyer countered. We sympathize, but legal frameworks exist for a reason. Bennett stepped up, his voice cutting through. Then let's change the framework. I've set up a trust, training, insurance, therapy, evaluations. Certified K9 pros will oversee Max under Emma's care. This isn't charity, it's responsibility. Hammond's lawyer bristled. Mr. Bennett has a personal interest. Bennett interrupted, sharp. My daughter Sarah died 5 years ago at Meridian, where Hammond now contracts. David was investigating. Max was part of it. Hammond wants him to bury what he knows. The room stilled, Councilwoman Blake's eyebrow arching. Evidence? Bennett's attorney laid a thick folder on the table. Memos, reports, Max's training logs from David's last case. Suddenly it wasn't just about custody, it was a scandal. Sheriff Evans muttered, "David was onto something big," as the counsel skimmed the pages. Blake turned to Emma. "Miss Carter, would you speak?" Emma looked up, her voice shaky but clear. "Max was my dad's partner. Now he's mine. He keeps me safe, helps me remember, helps me talk. I don't want another dog, I want him." Silence fell. Then Blake nodded. "We've heard enough." The council deliberated. 10 minutes, 20, Margaret's fingers trembling on Emma's shoulder. Finally, they returned. "In light of extraordinary circumstances and proposed measures," Blake said, "we vote unanimously to approve Max's permanent placement with the Carters." Applause erupted, Margaret hugging Emma, Rick kissing her head, Max woofing softly. "Furthermore," Blake added, "Max's status shifts to certified therapy dog, helping children like Emma." Tears streamed down Margaret's face as Hammond's team slunk out, neighbors clapping outside. That night, on the porch swing, Emma curled up with Max, the air sweet with wildflowers. Rick handed her a compass, David's, saying, "Max helped you find your way. This can guide you forward." Emma whispered. "Daddy said Max could find what's lost." Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I think he was right."
Whoa.